In the lush slopes of the Himalayas, where clouds kissed the mountains and the air carried the scent of wildflowers, there lived a man named Sanji. His garden was a living canvas of colors and fragrances sprawling across the grounds of his small wooden house, a spectacle that drew visitors from distant villages. People said that his hands had been blessed by the gods, for even the most delicate and difficult-to-grow flowers bloomed under his care. But the outer beauty of his garden stood in stark contrast to the inner storm that plagued his heart. Sanji carried a constant restlessness that consumed him day by day, like a shadow lengthening at dusk. His brows were always furrowed, forming deep lines of worry on his sun-bronzed forehead. Every morning, before the first ray of sunlight touched the petals of his flowers, Sanji was already up, anxiously pacing the stone paths of his garden. His keen eyes examined every leaf, every bud, searching for signs of pests or disease. The morning dew barely had time to evaporate before he began his endless series of tasks, each performed with an almost painful intensity. When the wind blew stronger, Sanji would rush to shield his delicate orchids, building makeshift barriers from bamboo and cloth. If clouds threatened rain, he would spend hours adjusting the soil's drainage, fearing his precious roots would rot. Birds that dared to perch on his bushes were met with shouts and harsh gestures, even if they were merely seeking a place to rest. The neighbors, though they admired the beauty of his garden, kept their distance. The village children, who once loved to watch butterflies dancing among the flowers, now avoided passing near his gate, frightened by Sanji's frequent outbursts whenever a stray ball threatened his plants. Even the monks from the local temple, who occasionally stopped by to admire his garden, noticed the unbalanced energy of the place. It was as if the beauty of the flowers was imprisoned by the anxiety of their caretaker. At night, while others rested, Sanji remained awake, his sleep disturbed by endless worries. What if an unexpected frost came during the night? What if a wild animal invaded his garden? What if ants discovered his most precious buds? Every nighttime sound made him rise, lantern in hand, to check on his cherished plants. The irony of his situation escaped Sanji. The harder he worked to create and maintain perfection in his garden, the more chaos he generated within his own mind. His flowers were admired by all for their serenity and natural beauty, yet he himself had become like a strangling vine, choking his inner peace with constant fears and worries. In his obsessive pursuit of perfection, Sanji had forgotten the most fundamental lesson his own garden was trying to teach him. Nature does not struggle against itself. Flowers do not worry about tomorrow, do not fear the rain or the wind, do not fret over birds or insects. They simply exist in harmony with everything around them, blooming and withering to the natural rhythm of the seasons. The elders of the village, in their wisdom, often said that Sanji's garden was a reversed reflection of his soul. The more beautiful and orderly the exterior became, the more chaotic and disturbed his inner world grew. His flowers displayed the peace and serenity he so desperately longed for, but could not find within himself. His reputation in the village had changed over the years. From Sanji, the skilled gardener, he had become Sanji, the troubled man. People whispered about how someone capable of creating such beauty could carry so much turmoil in his heart. Some even said he had made a pact with the spirits of the mountain, trading his inner peace for the ability to cultivate extraordinary flowers. And so, Sanji's days passed in an endless cycle of worry and control, his fingers calloused from working the earth, his mind exhausted from battling imaginary invaders of his private paradise. His garden had become both his greatest joy and his heaviest prison, and he couldn't see that the bars of this prison were made not of bamboo or wood, but of his own fears and anxieties. It was a peculiar spring morning when the air was especially clear, and the mountains seemed closer than usual. The sun had just emerged from behind the snowy peaks, and Sanji was already in his morning ritual of inspection. His eyes anxiously scanned each flower bed, and his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the supports of the vines that had shifted overnight. That's when he spotted a group of bluebirds landing in his garden. These weren't ordinary birds. They were the rare Himalayan blue thrushes, known for their beauty and melodious song. But Sanji didn't see beauty in that moment. He only saw threats to the precious lotus seeds he had planted the night before. Get out of here," he shouted, waving his arms frantically and running towards the birds. His face was red with anger, and beads of sweat ran down his furrowed brow. The birds took flight in a whirl of blue feathers, their song replaced by the frightened beating of wings. At that exact moment, a silent figure appeared at the garden gate. It was an elderly monk, dressed in a simple saffron robe, with a serene smile on his time-worn face. His eyes glowed with ancient wisdom, and he carried only a small bamboo staff and a begging bowl. The monk remained silent for a few moments, watching Sanji, who, still panting from chasing away the birds, hadn't noticed his presence. When their gazes finally met, the monk spoke in a gentle voice that seemed to carry the very silence of the mountains. "How curious," he said. "I see flowers dancing with the wind, yet a gardener fighting against the breeze. I see plants embracing the sun and rain, but a man rejecting his own nature." Sanji, caught off guard both by the monk's presence and his enigmatic words, felt his face flush again, this time with shame. Something about the visitor's presence made him suddenly aware of his own agitation. "Venerable One," Sanji replied, trying to regain his composure, "don't you understand that I must protect my garden? Every seed, every sprout is precious. How can I find peace when there are so many threats?" The monk smiled even more warmly and, without asking permission, stepped into the garden. His bare feet touched the ground so lightly that they left no trace on the freshly cultivated earth. He stopped in front of a bed of wildflowers that Sanji considered weeds and had planned to uproot that very morning. "Tell me, Sanji," the monk said, crouching down to gently touch a small yellow flower, "why do these flowers grow so vigorously without any care, while your orchids require so much attention?" Sanji opened his mouth to reply, but realized he had no ready answer. The monk continued, "And why do the birds you chase away so eagerly always return, while the butterflies you so desire in your garden seem to avoid it?" The silence that followed seemed to awaken something in Sanji. For the first time in a long while, he truly listened to the sounds of his garden. The hum of bees, the rustle of leaves, the distant song of the birds he had chased away. It was a natural symphony that had always been there, yet his own shouts and worries had drowned it out. The monk slowly rose and, with a gesture, invited Sanji to sit with him on a small stone bench. Reluctant but intrigued, Sanji accepted the invitation. He felt a strange sensation as he allowed himself to sit in his own garden, something he hadn't done in years, always too busy with his endless tasks. "You've built a paradise," said the monk, "but you live in it as if you were in hell. Your flowers display the perfect harmony of nature, yet your heart is in constant turmoil. How can a garden so beautiful be born of so much disturbance?" The monk's words struck Sanji like thunder on a clear day. It was as if, for the first time, he saw himself through someone else's eyes, not just as the guardian of an extraordinary garden, but as a man imprisoned by his own worries. "But how?" Sanji asked, his voice betraying a vulnerability he had long kept hidden. "How can I not worry when so much is at stake? How can I simply accept that things might go wrong?" The monk didn't respond immediately. Instead, he picked up a fallen leaf and placed it in Sanji's palm. "Sometimes," he said softly, "we must let some leaves fall so that others may grow. Nature understands this. When will we?" The sun was already high in the sky when the monk rose from the stone bench and, with a gentle gesture, invited Sanji to walk through the garden. It felt strange for Sanji to stroll down his own paths without carrying tools or worrying about tasks. Each step felt both familiar and entirely new. They reached a special bed where Sanji cultivated his precious lotus flowers. The small artificial pond he had created mirrored the sky like a natural mirror, and the flowers rose majestically from the water, their pink petals contrasting with the dark green leaves. "Look at these lotus flowers, Sanji," the monk began, sitting by the edge of the pond. "They are born in dark mud, grow through murky water, and yet emerge pristine. They don't struggle against their humble origin, don't feel shame for the muck that nourishes them, nor do they boast of their beauty when they finally reach the surface." Sanji observed the flowers with new eyes. For years, he had prided himself on cultivating lotuses in his garden, considering them a symbol of his skill as a gardener. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to see beyond their superficial beauty. Notice how they respond to different conditions. the monk continued, picking up a small pebble and tossing it into the water. Ripples disturb the pond's surface, making the lotus flowers sway gently. They don't resist the movement of the water. They don't break in the agitation. They simply dance with the waves, and when the water calms, they naturally return to their position. At that moment, a strong gust of wind swept down from the mountains, causing all the garden's flowers to bow. Sanji felt his body instinctively tense. His first impulse was to rush to protect the more delicate plants. But the monk placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, holding him in place. "Just watch," the monk whispered, and Sanji watched, heart pounding as his garden responded to the wind. The lotus flowers bowed gracefully, their flexible stems allowing them to move without breaking. The delicate orchids danced on their supports, their firm roots keeping them secure even as their blossoms swayed. Even the tallest bamboo, which had worried him so much, swayed in harmony with the breeze, its strong, flexible stems embracing the movement rather than resisting it. When the wind passed, each plant naturally returned to its place, none of them harmed by the experience. Sanji realized he had been holding his breath, and he exhaled slowly, feeling an old tension beginning to dissolve in his chest. "Do you see how nature does not fight against itself?" the monk asked. "Each flower, each leaf, each stem instinctively understands what you've been struggling so hard to control, the art of being flexible in the face of change." The monk stood up and walked over to a small wildflower growing between the stones of the path, the same kind Sanji used to pull up, thinking it a weed. "Look at this little flower," said the monk. "It grows in the most adverse conditions, between stones with little soil and water. It doesn't complain about its position. It doesn't envy the orchids in their elegant pots. It simply blooms where it was planted, fully expressing its nature." Sanji approached the small flower. Its petals were a deep purple, and although it was much smaller than the cultivated flowers in his garden, it had a beauty of its own, wild and authentic. "But venerable one," Sanji said, his voice revealing genuine confusion, "if I'm not meant to worry about protecting and controlling the garden, how can I ensure that it will keep flourishing?" The monk smiled, his eyes shining with compassion. "There is a great difference between caring and controlling, Sanji. When you care, you act with love and respect for the nature of each being. When you try to control, you act out of fear and distrust of the natural order of things." At that moment, the bluebird Sanji had chased away earlier returned, gently landing in nearby trees. Their melodious song filled the air, creating a natural harmony with the buzzing of bees and the rustling of leaves. "Your garden doesn't need protection from life, Sanji," the monk said softly. "It needs space to express life in all its forms. The flowers do not fear the birds, the wind, or the rain. Each element has its role in nature's dance." A butterfly flitted past them, landing delicately on one of the lotus flowers. Sanji watched as the flower gently bowed under the tiny weight of the insect, welcoming its presence instead of resisting it. "The true beauty of a garden," the monk concluded, "is not in its controlled perfection, but in its ability to harmonize all aspects of life, from the tallest trees to the smallest ants, from the rarest flowers to the most common weeds. Each element contributes to the symphony of the whole." After the monk's departure that day, Sanji remained seated by the lotus pond for hours, watching the sunlight dance across the water's surface. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the familiar urge to stand up, check his plants, or drive away unwelcome visitors. Instead, he allowed himself simply to be present, like the very flowers he cultivated. In the days that followed, a subtle change took place, almost imperceptible at first. Sanji still rose before dawn, but his early moments were no longer filled with anxiety and worry. Instead of rushing out to inspect for potential problems, he began a new ritual. He would sit quietly on his stone bench and watch the garden awaken with the first light of day. One morning, as he observed a spider weaving its web between two orchids, Sanji had a profound realization. For years, he had seen spider webs as signs of neglect, hurrying to remove them whenever he found them. But now, for the first time, he allowed himself to marvel at the web's intricate design, the precision of the little weaver's movements, the way dew transformed the silken threads into strands of shimmering pearls. "How did I spend so long without seeing this beauty?" he whispered to himself, as the spider continued its work, undisturbed by his presence. On another occasion, a powerful storm approached from the mountains. In the past, Sanji would have panicked, rushing to shield every delicate flower, every vulnerable bud. But that day, something different happened. Instead of fighting the arrival of the rain, he decided to observe it, remembering the monk's words about the natural wisdom of plants. Sitting on his veranda, sheltered only by the eaves, Sanji watched his garden transform under the rain. The lotus flowers received the drops with their broad leaves, which directed the water perfectly to their roots. The orchids, which he had always considered so fragile, gently closed their petals, protecting their inner parts without resisting the water bathing them. The bamboo swayed and danced with the wind, its deep roots keeping it steady even during the strongest gusts. They know, Sanji realized. They have always known how to care for themselves. The storm passed, and when the sun returned, his garden looked more vibrant than ever, revitalized by the rain. Not a single flower was destroyed, no plant uprooted. The very storm that had once worried him so deeply had revealed itself as a natural blessing, bringing new life and freshness to his garden. As the days went by, Sanji began to notice changes not only in his perception of the garden, but in himself. His hands, once always tense and restless, now moved more gently among the plants. His face, which had long borne deep lines of worry, began to soften, especially when he smiled at the birds now visiting his garden freely. One particularly meaningful morning came when Sanji found a nest of young birds built among his treasured wisteria. In the past, he would have removed the nest immediately, fearing the birds would damage the flowers. But now, he found himself fascinated by their choice of location. The birds had found the perfect balance between the hanging clusters of purple blooms, creating a home that seemed a natural part of the garden's design. "You are gardeners too," he said softly to the birds, "bringing your own form of life and beauty to this space." It was during an evening meditation that Sanji had his deepest realization. Watching the shadows of the trees stretch across the garden, he understood that his old pursuit of perfection had, in truth, been a deep fear of impermanence. Every fading flower, every fallen leaf had felt like a personal defeat, a reminder of the transience of all things. But now he began to understand. The true beauty of his garden lay not in keeping every flower in eternal bloom, but in accepting and honoring the natural cycle of growth, blossoming, fading, and renewal. Each phase had its own beauty, its own wisdom to impart. The garden never needed my constant worry, Sanji reflected. It only needed my mindful presence, my loving care, and my willingness to let nature follow its own perfect path. And so, as the sun set behind the mountains, and the first stars appeared in the sky, Sanji felt a peace he had long sought. A peace that had always been there, as natural as the growth of a flower, waiting only for him to stop struggling and let it blossom in his own heart. Sanji's transformation did not go unnoticed by the villagers. What began as curious whispers among neighbors soon grew into something more, a kind of local legend that spread through the Himalayan slopes. The garden, once known for its secluded beauty, became a gathering place, a living sanctuary where nature and humanity danced in harmony. Children were the first to notice the change. One day, a little girl named Mai, who had always admired the flowers from afar, found the courage to approach the gate. To her surprise, she found Sanji smiling, inviting her in to see a family of butterflies that had made their home among the flowers. Soon, other children followed her lead, and the garden, once guarded with obsessive care, became a place of discovery and childhood joy. "Look," Sanji would say to his young visitors, crouching down to show them a bud about to bloom. "The flower doesn't rush to open. It knows exactly when the time is right." His words, once filled with anxiety and control, now flowed with the same ease as the breeze brushing the petals of his flowers. The village elders, who had long watched Sanji with a mix of pity and concern, began to make regular visits to the garden. They found not only a place of beauty, but a space for peace and contemplation. Sanji welcomed them with green tea served in old ceramic cups, and together they would watch the sunset paint the sky in colors rivaling the most beautiful flowers in the garden. "How did you bring about this change, Sanji?" the village elder once asked. watching as a dragonfly landed delicately on a lotus leaf. "It wasn't me who changed the garden," Sanji replied with a serene smile. "It was the garden that changed me. I've learned that our inner peace is like a seed. It already contains all the beauty we need, just waiting for the right conditions to blossom." Local farmers, who once secretly scoffed at his obsession with ornamental flowers, began to seek his advice, not only on gardening, but also on finding balance in their own lives. Sanji welcomed them among his flower beds, sharing not only growing techniques, but also the wisdom he had learned about accepting life's natural cycles. "Our worries are like weeds," he would say while working alongside them. "The more we fight against them, the stronger they grow. Sometimes the best we can do is watch them with kindness and understand that they, too, have their place in life's grand garden." Even the monks from the local temple, including the one who first planted the seeds of transformation in his heart, began to make regular visits. They found in Sanji's garden a living example of Buddhist teachings on impermanence, non-attachment, and the interconnectedness of all things. One particularly meaningful morning, Sanji found a small group of young monks meditating near the lotus pond. Rather than feeling disturbed by their unannounced presence, he sat quietly with them, realizing that his garden had become something greater than himself, a sacred space where others could find the same lessons that had transformed him. As the seasons passed, Sanji's garden blossomed in ways he could never have planned or controlled. Plants he had never cultivated began to appear, brought by the wind or birds, adding new colors and textures to the space. Instead of pulling them out, as he would have in the past, Sanji watched them with curiosity, allowing them to find their own place in the garden's ecosystem. Visitors often remarked that there was something different in the air, a special quality they couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the beauty of the flowers or the harmonious design of the beds. It was something deeper, more subtle, the tangible presence of a peace that seemed to emanate not only from the plants, but from the gardener himself. The secret, Sanji shared with those who asked, is not in trying to create perfection, but in recognizing the perfection that already exists in each moment. Every fallen leaf, every wilting flower, every weed growing between the stones, it's all part of life's sacred dance. On full moon nights, Sanji now opened his garden to the entire community. Paper lanterns were hung between the trees, their soft glow lighting the paths where people of all ages gathered to share stories, meditate, or simply be together in silence. The garden, which had once been his prison of worries, had transformed into a sanctuary of healing for the whole village. And so, the man who was once known for his restlessness became a living symbol of transformation. His garden remained as beautiful as ever, but now its beauty ran deeper, more true. A reflection not only of the care given to the plants, but of the inner peace that had finally found its way into the gardener's heart.